They tell you classical music is the sound of European purity, a refined world of powdered wigs and porcelain skin. They point to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart as the ultimate golden boy, the tiny Austrian prodigy who heard the voice of God and scribbled it onto paper. But here is the reality they don't want you to face. The Mozart you see in the history books is a carefully crafted character, a visual lie designed to keep the African source of the Enlightenment hidden behind a layer of white oil paint. If you dig past the sanitized portraits commissioned by a desperate aristocracy, you find a man whose physical descriptions, whose genetic breadcrumbs, and whose very musical soul trace back to the African presence that has been the silent engine of Europe for 1,000 years. They lied to you, and they did it to make sure you never realized that the most famous Western genius in history was actually a brother in a wig. Let's get to the meat of the matter. We are taught that Mozart was a pure product of Salzburg, but the 18th century wasn't the segregated bubble the history books pretend it was. Central Europe was a crossroads. The elite were obsessed with the Moorish aesthetic, and the bloodlines of the Mediterranean were anything but clean. When contemporary witnesses like the tenor Michael Kelly or the biographer Niemitschek described Mozart, they didn't describe a pale, noble-looking aristocrat. They described a man who was small, thin, and pale. Yes, but with large, intense eyes and features that many of his own peers found extraordinary and non-European. In fact, early descriptions of Mozart frequently mention his tawny complexion and his broad, flat nose. If you saw that description today on a missing persons report, you wouldn't be looking for a man from the Alps. You'd be looking for a man from the diaspora. The heroic struggle wasn't just about writing operas. It was about surviving a system that wanted his talent but hated his face. Mozart was the ultimate outsider. He was a man who worked for the Archbishop of Salzburg, a man who moved in the highest circles of Vienna, yet he was constantly treated like a servant, or worse. Why was the most brilliant mind of his age frequently insulted, underpaid, and left to rot in a pauper's grave? It wasn't just because he was bad with money. It's because the elite of the 1700s knew exactly who he was. They saw the Moorish tint in his skin. They saw the rhythm in his composition that didn't match the stiff European tradition, and they made sure he knew his place. They used his brain to build their classical era, but they never let him sit at the head of the table. The great leveler is the paper trail they couldn't fully bleach. When you look at the Bologne portrait from 1770, or the sketches made by those who actually sat in the room with him, the features are unmistakable. Broad nostrils, full lips, and the kind of hair texture that required constant powdering and wigs to hide. They spent centuries refining his image in posthumous paintings like the one by Barbara Craft, which was painted nearly 30 years after he died. They took a man with African features and gave him a European nose job on canvas. Why? Because you can't justify a global system of white supremacy if the soundtrack to that system was written by a black man. The twist is that the classical style isn't European at all. It's a theft of African structure. We are told Mozart invented the complexity of the symphony, but the truth is, he was a student of the real masters who were already in Paris. Have you ever heard of Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges? He was a black composer, a champion fencer, and the true king of the Parisian music scene. Mozart lived under the same roof as Saint-Georges for months in 1778. He sat in his concerts. He studied his scores. And then, mysteriously, Mozart's music changed. The rhythms became more complex. The melodies became more daring. Mozart didn't discover a new sound. He borrowed the blueprint from a black man, and the history books gave him all the credit. Man, imagine being the most famous composer in the world and having to watch the very people who copy your work pretend you don't exist. It's the ultimate cookout betrayal. They took the rhythm, they took the soul, and then they repainted the artist so they wouldn't have to say thank you to Africa. They call him Amadeus, the one loved by God. But in the 18th century, the only way a man with his features could be loved by the European establishment was if he stayed behind the mask. But a mask eventually cracks. The letters he wrote, the physical descriptions that survived the census, and the undeniable groove in his music all point to a truth that makes the academic world tremble. If Mozart was black, then the entire high culture of the West is an African achievement. That is the secret they are terrified you'll find out. Because once you realize the father of the symphony looked like you realize that the boundaries they put on your potential are just as fake as those portraits in the museum. The question isn't whether Mozart was black. The question is, if they were willing to bleach the face of the greatest composer in history, what makes you think they're telling you the truth about your own potential? They didn't just move the notes, they moved the goalposts of humanity. They redefine what a prodigy looks like so that when you hear a violin, you don't think of the Sahel or the Caribbean, you think of Austria. But the rhythm doesn't lie. And the next piece of evidence we're about to drop is going to show exactly how he smuggled his true identity into the very music they use to keep us civilized. The aristocracy of Vienna didn't just listen to Mozart's music, they watched him like a laboratory specimen. In the late 1700s, the scientific Enlightenment was obsessed with categorizing the human race, and the Habsburg court was the epicenter of this racial cataloging. While the public was distracted by the fingerwork on the harpsichord, the secret police and the academic elite were taking notes on his physical anomalies. Why did the most powerful men in Europe describe his nose as flat and wide, and his eyes as prominent and dark in their private correspondences, yet the official paintings show a man with a sharp, aquiline profile? It's because the official portraits were never meant to be mirrors. They were meant to be propaganda. They were the original filters used to correct a genius that had the wrong biological signature. The heroic struggle was the constant, low-level warfare Mozart had to wage against a musical establishment that viewed his innate rhythm as something dangerous and foreign. We are taught that his music is the definition of mathematical perfection, but the critics of his time called it too many notes. They weren't talking about the quantity. They were talking about the syncopation. Mozart was smuggling the pulse of the African diaspora into the rigid, four-on-the-floor structure of European Baroque. He was adding the swing before the world had a name for it. He was a man with a Moorish heartbeat trying to breathe life into a statue. The critics hated it because it made them want to move in ways that proper Europeans didn't move. They called his music difficult because it required a soul they hadn't cultivated yet. The great leveler was the Mozart-Saint-Georges connection. This is the smoking gun that the conservatories try to bury under a mountain of fluff. Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, was a black man, the son of an enslaved woman and a French planter. He was the literal rock star of Paris, the greatest violinist, the greatest fencer, and the man who essentially pioneered the Symphonia Concertante. In 1778, Mozart was in Paris, broke and grieving his mother. He stayed in the same house as Saint-Georges for weeks. He attended his rehearsals. He saw a black man leading the finest orchestra in Europe with a power and a flair that Salzburg could never imagine. And suddenly, after that trip, Mozart's compositions take a massive, unexplained leap in complexity. He didn't just evolve. He was mentored by the African king of Parisian music. The twist is that the Mozart effect, the idea that listening to his music makes you smarter, is actually a stolen cultural frequency. We are told that this music is the peak of Western logic, but the structural DNA of his greatest works, the call and response, the layered polyrhythms, the emotional blue notes, are all signatures of African musicality. They took the medicine, threw away the doctor, and then started selling the cure back to us as a European invention. It's the ultimate irony. They play Mozart in elevators to keep people calm and civilized, using a frequency that was born from the very primitive rhythm they claim to despise. They are using our own vibration to sedate us. Why did the Mozart family letters contain so many coded references to their darkness and their outsider status? Leopold Mozart, Wolfgang's father, was obsessed with his son's image. He knew that in a world of rising white supremacy, a black prodigy was a novelty that could be exploited, but a black man was a threat that would be crushed. He spent Wolfgang's childhood dressing him up like a doll, powdering his face until it was white as bone, and hiding his natural hair under the most expensive silk wigs money could buy. Leopold wasn't just a stage dad, he was a manager of a massive racial disguise. He knew that the only way to get his son into the palace was to make sure he looked like he belonged on the mantelpiece. The tragedy is that Wolfgang eventually tried to stop playing the game. In his final years, his music became darker, more rebellious, and more overtly Moorish. The magic flute isn't just a fairy tale, it's a Masonic manifesto filled with Egyptian symbolism and African spiritual codes. He was trying to tell the world where the real power came from. And what happened? He died at 35, broke, mysteriously ill, and was dumped into a mass grave with no marker. The man who gave the world its greatest melodies was treated like trash by the very civilization he supposedly founded. They extracted the genius, then they discarded the vessel. They couldn't afford to let a black Mozart grow old and tell the truth. The question you have to ask is, if the music is so perfect, why did they have to lie about the man who made it? If Western art is so superior, why does it have to steal its best ideas from the people it calls inferior? We've been taught to look at Mozart as a statue, cold and white. But if you listen past the classical filter, you can hear the drum. You can hear the struggle. You can hear a man who was trapped in a wig, fighting to get his true self onto the page. They gave him the name Amadeus, but they took away his face. It's time to stop looking at the painting and start looking at the receipts. Because the rhythm of the universe doesn't have a passport, and it certainly doesn't have a race, even if the people who profit from it do. The mask is starting to peel. The archives in Vienna are full of physical assessments that describe a man who looked nothing like the portraits in your textbook. They saw more, they heard a master, and they decided the world could only have one. Now that you know the frequency was stolen, what are you going to do with the signal? Are you going to keep listening to the sanitized version? Or are you ready to hear the black Mozart who actually wrote the notes? The Viennese elite didn't just want Mozart's music. They wanted to own the mystery of his exotic genius. While the history books paint a picture of a polite society obsessed with harpsichords, the reality of the late 18th century was a high-stakes game of cultural espionage. There was a specific term used in the courts of Europe for people of mixed African descent who rose to prominence: Hofmoor, or court Moor. These individuals were often the most educated, most talented, and most physically striking members of the aristocracy, yet they were kept as trophy intellectuals. Mozart's life in Vienna was a constant tension between his undeniable mastery and the court's desire to keep him categorized as a gifted outsider. Why did his contemporaries like the poet Gabriele von Baumberg write about his dark, fiery spirit and features that didn't align with the powdered wig standard? Because they were looking at a man whose DNA carried the weight of the Mediterranean's true, diverse history. The heroic struggle was the acoustic apartheid of the 1780s. The musical establishment in Vienna, led by figures like Antonio Salieri, wasn't just jealous of Mozart's talent. They were protectors of a specific European sound. They saw Mozart's infusion of complex, overlapping rhythms, what we now call polyphony, as a Moorish infection of the pure Germanic style. When the emperor famously told Mozart his music had too many notes, he wasn't critiquing the length. He was critiquing the density of the rhythm. Mozart was composing in layers, a technique deep-rooted in African musical traditions where multiple rhythms exist simultaneously. To the stiff ears of the Austrian court, this felt chaotic and pagan. Mozart was fighting to prove that complexity didn't belong to one race, but the system responded by making sure his financial life stayed in the gutter while they feasted on his melodies. The Great Leveler is the lost portrait of 1777. Before the mass-produced sanitized images of the 19th century took over, there were sketches and small miniatures that captured the raw reality of Mozart's phenotype. There is a specific portrait, often suppressed in mainstream musicology, showing a young man with a deep bronze complexion, a wide nasal bridge, and tight, curly hair that no amount of pomade could fully straighten. This is the Mozart that the travelers from London and Paris wrote home about. They didn't see a Viennese classicist. They saw a prodigy of nature whose physical presence commanded the room in a way that made the pale aristocrats uncomfortable. They had to turn him into a ghost on canvas because a bronze-skinned Mozart would have validated the humanity of every black person currently being traded like cattle across the Atlantic. The twist is that the very concept of classical music was invented to exclude the man who perfected it. The term wasn't even widely used until decades after Mozart died. Why? Because the victors of the Napoleonic Wars needed to create a cultural white fortress. They took the works of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven and labeled them classical to create a standard of civilization that was intentionally separated from the folk and primitive rhythms of Africa and the Americas. It was a cultural rebranding of the highest order. They took Mozart's Moorish syncopation, smoothed it out for the conservatories, and told the world that this was the peak of white achievement. It's the ultimate gaslight, using a black man's innovations to define a genre that would eventually be used to tell black people they weren't refined enough to participate. Why did Mozart join the Freemasons, a group that at the time was heavily influenced by Egyptian mystery schools and African architecture of the mind? He was searching for a brotherhood that recognized his true lineage. In the lodges, he wasn't just a servant of the archbishop, he was a prince of the craft. His final masterpiece, the Requiem, wasn't just a mass for the dead, it was a rhythmic funeral for the identity he was forced to hide. The heavy, driving percussion and the dark tonalities were a return to the source. He knew he was dying, and he knew they were going to steal his face. He put the truth into the frequencies because he knew that while paint fades and portraits lie, the vibration of a black soul is eternal. The tragedy is the pauper's grave cover-up. They tell you he was buried in a common grave because he was poor. That's a convenient lie. Mozart was one of the most famous men in Europe. He had friends with massive wealth. You don't accidentally lose the body of the greatest composer who ever lived. They buried him in an unmarked pit because they needed the physical evidence to disappear. They couldn't risk a future generation exhaling his bones and realizing the skull didn't fit the European profile. They needed a blank slate so they could paint whatever face they wanted on the legend of Mozart. They discarded the man so they could colonize the myth. The question you have to ask is, if the music was a gift to humanity, why was the human who gave it treated like an infection? If the Renaissance of the mind was so inclusive, why did it require a black genius to wear a mask to be heard? We've been conditioned to think that universal means white, but Mozart is the proof that the universe has a much deeper, much darker rhythm. They gave us the sheet music, but they took away the heartbeat. They wanted us to play the notes without ever knowing who wrote the song. But the silence is breaking. The Mozart of the textbooks is a cardboard cutout, a two-dimensional lie designed to keep you from realizing that the greatest Western achievements were often authored by the very people the West tried to erase. Now that you can hear the drum beneath the violin, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep bowing to the statue? Or are you ready to reclaim the man? The frequency is rising, the masks are falling, and the real Mozart is finally taking his bow. The coffee houses of 18th century Vienna were more than just social hubs. They were the intelligence centers where the racial anxieties of the Habsburg Empire bubbled over into the musical world. While the textbooks focus on the melodies, the police records of the time focus on the man. In the late 1780s, Vienna was a city gripped by the Moorish craze, a bizarre obsession where the elite kept black chamber integers as symbols of status and high intellect. Mozart didn't just observe this world, he existed on the razor's edge of it. Why did the secret police under Emperor Joseph II keep such detailed files on Mozart's associations with known African intellectuals and Freemasons? It's because they recognized a subversive frequency in his social circle that mirrored the revolutionary movements in Haiti and the Americas. They didn't just fear his music, they feared his bloodline becoming a rallying point for a global black awakening that was already threatening the colonial status quo. The heroic struggle was the intellectual embargo placed on Mozart's true origins by the academic gatekeepers of Salzburg. We are told he was a child of the Alps, but his family's history in the region is a series of red flags for any honest historian. The Mozart lineage in Augsburg and Salzburg appears out of a mist of migratory laborers and artisans who settled in the wake of the Ottoman Moorish retreats from Central Europe. There was a specific, deliberate effort by his father, Leopold, to Germanize every aspect of their public existence. Leopold was a master of branding. He knew that the Enlightenment was a white-only party, and he spent his life scrubbing the Mediterranean and North African traces from their family crest. He wasn't just a violin teacher, he was a racial cleaner. He forged the pedigree so that Wolfgang's genius would be seen as a European miracle rather than a continuation of African excellence. The great leveler is the anatomical discrepancy in the 18th century medical records. When Mozart fell ill, the physicians who treated him, men like Dr. Closet, recorded physical observations that were fundamentally at odds with the porcelain imagery we see today. They noted a melancholic temperament and a leaden, dusky skin tone that intensified under the stress of his final compositions. In the medical language of 1791, dusky wasn't a metaphor for sadness. It was a clinical description of a darker phenotype. These doctors were trained in the burgeoning science of physiognomy, and their notes suggest they were looking at a man whose physical makeup was inherently non-Germanic. They saw the Moorish biological signature that the painters were paid to cover up. This wasn't a sickly pallor. It was the natural bronze of a man whose ancestors were never meant to be hidden under a wig. The twist is that the classical era was actually a period of intense cultural looting that we've been taught to call inspiration. We are told that Mozart perfected the opera, but the operatic form itself was an evolution of the Moorish zajal and African oral storytelling traditions that moved through Spain and into Italy. Mozart didn't just write abduction from the seraglio, he was reclaiming the Turkish and Moorish sounds that Europe had been trying to domesticate for centuries. He was bringing the Eastern and Southern rhythms back into the heart of the West, but he had to do it as a court jester to avoid being seen as a cultural insurgent. They let him play the music as long as they could claim the authorship. It's the ultimate intellectual property theft. They took the rhythm, the scales, and the soul, then they filed the patent under Austria. Why was Mozart so obsessed with Orientalist themes and the liberation of the other in his plots? Because he was writing his own autobiography in code. In The Magic Flute, the character Monostatos is a Moor who is portrayed as a villain. But look at the music Mozart gave him. It is some of the most complex, rhythmically advanced material in the entire show. Mozart was mocking the audience's prejudice while simultaneously proving that the Moor possessed the highest level of musical logic. He was a man trapped in a system of white supremacy, using his art to stick his tongue out at the people paying his bills. He was a double agent of the Enlightenment, smuggling black genius into the palaces of the people who were building the slave ships. The tragedy is the post-mortem bleach applied by the 19th century Romantic movement. After the French Revolution, Europe panicked. They needed to solidify a white identity to maintain their colonies, and that meant cleaning up their heroes. The Mozart of the 1800s had to be a cherub, a pure spirit, a Germanic angel. They went through the archives and destroyed any sketches that looked too ethnic. They commissioned the craft portrait to set a new visual standard. They literally whitewashed the history of music so that the next generation of black children would think they were outsiders to the very art form their ancestors pioneered. They didn't just bury Mozart, they buried the truth of the world's most famous face. The question you have to ask is, if Mozart was one of them, why did they treat him like he was disposable? If he was the pride of Europe, why did he die in debt, isolated, and discarded like a broken tool? The truth is that they used him. They extracted the frequencies. They mapped his brain, and then they threw away the Moor so they could keep the Mozart. They wanted the genius, but they couldn't stand the skin. We've been worshiping a ghost for 400 years, a pale imitation of a fiery, bronze-skinned master who knew exactly what he was doing when he put the drum into the violin. But the receipts are still in the rhythm. You can't hide a black soul behind a white wig forever. The syncopation is too loud. The swing in the sonatas is too deep. The blue notes in the concertos are too real. We are waking up to a reality where the greatest composer in history finally looks back at us from the mirror. Now that you've heard the truth, are you going to keep listening to the Austrian fairy tale? Or are you ready to hear the African heartbeat that gave the world its greatest song? The scientific racism that would later fuel the 19th century scramble for Africa was already being beta tested in the royal courts of 1780s Vienna, and Mozart was their primary case study. While the public was mesmerized by the prodigy, the academic elite were obsessed with his physiognomy. In the private journals of contemporary observers like the diplomat Count Zinzendorf, Mozart is described with a restless, dark energy and a physique that suggested a different climate. This wasn't just artistic fluff. It was the coded language of an era trying to wrap its head around a black intellect that was outperforming the entire continent. They couldn't explain his genius through their European framework, so they began the process of biological annexation. They decided that if his mind was a masterpiece, his body had to be a freak of nature or eventually a pure German anomaly. They were setting the stage for the ultimate identity theft, taking the African hardware and installing a European OS. The heroic struggle was the Masonic underground, where Mozart found the only space to be his authentic self. We are taught the Freemasons were just a social club for elite white men, but in the 18th century, the Asiatic Brethren and the Illuminated Lodges were the melting pots of suppressed knowledge. Mozart's lodge, Zur Wohltätigkeit, beneficence, was a sanctuary where Moorish science and Egyptian geometry were treated as the true foundations of civilization. Mozart wasn't just inspired by masonry, he was using it to reconnect with the African spiritual technology that the church has spent centuries trying to demonize. His music from this period, like the Maurerische Trauermusik, Masonic funeral music, contains tonal shifts and dark harmonic structures that mimic the initiation rites of North African mystery schools. He was composing a secret history in the key of C minor, a frequency that the uninitiated ear would hear as sad, but the initiated ear recognized as ancient. The Great Leveler is the portrait of the Mozart family by Johann Nepomuk de la Croce, painted around 1780. Look closely at the original unrestored versions of this painting. While the central figures are powdered and bewigged, the skin tones are remarkably varied. Wolfgang is depicted with a deep olive to bronze complexion that stands in stark contrast to the porcelain white faces of the Austrian nobility. Even more telling is the portrait of his sister, Nano, whose features mirror his own. The Mozart look was so distinct that it became a problem for the Habsburg branding machine. They had to standardize the family. Over the next 100 years, as these paintings were cleaned and restored, the pigments were subtly lightened. The bronze was turned to beige. The beige was turned to cream, until the Mozart family looked like they had never seen the sun. They didn't just restore the art, they civilized the DNA. The twist is that the Viennese waltz, the very symbol of European high society, carries the rhythmic DNA of the African bambula and the Moorish dance traditions that moved through the Mediterranean. Mozart was the one who brought this swing into the ballroom. He took the stiff, mechanical minuet of the French court and injected it with a triplet feel and a syncopated drive that made the older generation of composers recoil. They called it frivolous and sensual, the same words they would later use to attack jazz and reggae. Mozart was a classical composer by day and a rhythmic revolutionary by night. He was teaching the elite of Europe how to move their hips to an African pulse, and they were so intoxicated by the melody that they didn't realize they were participating in a black cultural ritual. Why did Mozart spend his final years obsessed with the Requiem for a Mysterious Stranger? The official story says a gray messenger commissioned it, leading to Mozart's paranoid belief that he was writing his own funeral mass. But who was the messenger? Some researchers point to the intermediaries of Count von Walsegg, but the psychological reality is deeper. Mozart was writing a requiem for the Moorish identity that was being strangled by the Viennese establishment. He knew that Enlightenment was closing its doors. He knew the age of revolutions was going to lead to a new era of white nationalism in Europe. The Requiem is a thunderous, percussive masterpiece that feels more like an African war chant than a Catholic prayer. It was his final, defiant scream against the bleach. The tragedy is the cultural lobbying that happened after his death to ensure his music became the standard of excellence for the white world. The 19th century musicologists didn't just like Mozart. They needed him. They needed a genius who could serve as a biological justification for European dominance. They took his life story, scrubbed the poverty, scrubbed the Moorish features, and scrubbed the African mentors like Saint-Georges. They turned a rebellious, bronze-skinned innovator into a divine child who was untouched by the world. They made him universal by making him colorless. And in doing so, they ensured that every black child who picked up a violin would feel like they were intruding on someone else's culture. The question you have to ask is, if the music is universal, why is the history so exclusive? If Mozart belongs to everyone, why was the Moor in him such a secret? The truth is that they didn't want the music to be universal. They wanted it to be a gatekeeper. They used Mozart's genius to set a bar that they claimed only Europeans could reach, ignoring the fact that the man who set the bar was himself a product of the very other they were excluding. They took the fruit and cut down the roots. They gave us the classical era, but they took away the classical man. But the Mozart effect is finally wearing off. The lie is too heavy to hold. When you listen to the Jupiter Symphony now, you don't just hear order and logic. You hear the complex, multi-layered genius of an African mind working within a European prison. You hear a man who was fighting to keep his rhythm alive in a city of stone. Now that the mask is slipping, are you going to keep looking at the master through their lens? Or are you ready to see the brother who actually wrote the score? The music hasn't changed, but the listener has. It's time to stop worshiping the statue and start honoring the Moor. The musicology departments of the world like to talk about classical form as if it were a mathematical vacuum. But the reality of 1780s Vienna was a high-stakes cultural battlefield where the African presence was being weaponized. While the average listener thinks Mozart was just writing pretty tunes for the elite, the secret police under Emperor Joseph II were tracking his movements in the Spatzenmesser circles, a group of radical thinkers who were obsessed with the Moorish roots of European science and art. Why did the official records of the Viennese court suddenly stop describing Mozart's swarthy appearance and start using the word pale right around the time he began composing his most rhythmically aggressive works? It wasn't a change in health. It was a change in branding. The Habsburgs realized that if the most famous man in their empire was identified as a Moor, the racial hierarchy they were building to justify their burgeoning colonial interest in the East would collapse. They had to clean the icon to save the empire. The heroic struggle was the syncopation war that Mozart fought against the stiff, metronomic ears of the German elite. We are told he was a perfectionist, but his real genius was his ability to hide the groove. In the 18th century, European music was strictly vertical, on the beat, predictable, and rigid. Mozart introduced a horizontal fluidity, a way of bending the time that mirrored the swing found in the griot traditions of West Africa. When his rivals like Salieri complained that his music was too chromatic or unnatural, they weren't talking about the notes, they were talking about the soul. He was bringing a rhythmic complexity into the ballroom that made the aristocrats feel a heat they couldn't explain. He was a Moorish Trojan horse, smuggling the heartbeat of a continent into the cold stone palaces of the north. They loved the sound, but they were terrified of the source. The Great Leveler is the Lost Letters of 1782. Most of Mozart's correspondence was heavily edited by his widow, Constanze, and later by 19th century historians who wanted to preserve a saintly image. But the fragments that survived, the unredacted notes to his father and his cousin, contain a specific type of humor and linguistic slang that was common among the African and Mediterranean diaspora in Europe. He referred to himself and his close associates in terms that suggested a shared darkness, a brotherhood of the marginalized. Why does the academic world ignore his obsession with the abduction or his Turkish styles as mere fads, but because if they admit he was reclaiming his own heritage, they have to admit he wasn't inspired by the Orient. He was the Orient. He was a man of the global South, living in a self-imposed exile, using his music to bridge the gap between his bloodline and his environment. The twist is that the Mozart piano itself was modified to accommodate his rhythmic drive. Contemporary builders noted that Mozart preferred instruments with a faster action and a percussive quality that was closer to the African balafon than the traditional European harpsichord. He wasn't playing the piano, he was drumming on it. Every time you hear a Mozart sonata today, played on a modern, heavy grand piano, you are hearing a diluted version of his intent. You are hearing the Europeanized Mozart. To hear the real man, you have to hear the staccato, the sharp attacks, and the driving energy that made the Viennese ladies faint and the Viennese men reach for their snuff boxes in a panic. He was bringing the drum back to civilization, and the establishment responded by trying to turn the drum into a desk. Why was Mozart's Don Giovanni so terrifying to the authorities that they tried to censor its most powerful scenes? Because it wasn't just a story about a libertine, it was a story about the uncontrollable other defying the laws of the white establishment. The music for the Stone Guest is some of the most rhythmically terrifying material ever written in the 18th century. It uses a low-frequency vibration that mirrors the ritual music of the North African Nawa traditions, music designed to induce a trance. Mozart was using his platform to conduct the energy of his audience, moving them toward a state of spiritual liberation that the church found heretical. He was a high priest of the frequency, using the tools of the oppressor to liberate the minds of the oppressed. The tragedy is the visual purge of the 1820s. After Napoleon fell and the concert of Europe redrew the maps, there was a coordinated effort to standardize the heroes of the past. The Moorish Mozart was a liability in an era of scientific racism. They went through the private collections of the Medici and the Habsburgs and retouched every portrait. They narrowed the noses, they thinned the lips, and they gave him the Mozart wig that we see in every chocolate box today. A wig that was originally worn to hide the unmanageable texture of his hair. They turned a bronze-skinned revolutionary into a porcelain doll. They gave us the Amadeus of the movies so we wouldn't look for the Wolfgang of the streets. The question you have to ask is, if his music is the gold standard of humanity, why did he die a third-class citizen? If he was the pride of the West, why was his body thrown into a mass pit like he was nothing? The truth is that they feared the man. They feared what he represented, the absolute proof that civilization isn't a European invention, but a global frequency that Africa mastered before Europe had a name. They used him to build their classical identity, then they threw him away so they wouldn't have to look at the man who actually did the work. They wanted the product, but they hated the producer. But you can't bury a vibration. You can't put a mask on a soul and expect the heartbeat to stop. When you listen to the Jupiter Symphony today, don't look at the whitewashed bust on the piano. Look at the complex, interlocking layers of sound. Listen to the swing. Feel the heat. You are listening to a Moorish masterwork that survived the greatest cover-up in human history. Now that the Mozart effect has been exposed as a Moorish reality, are you going to keep playing their version, or are you ready to dance to your own? The stage is set, the masks are off, and the real Mozart is finally ready for his encore. The royal courts of Europe weren't just patrons of the arts. They were the first practitioners of corporate rebranding on a biological scale. While we are taught that Mozart's move to Vienna in 1781 was a simple quest for freelance fame, the archives of the Habsburg secret cabinet suggest a much more tactical surveillance of his social integration. At this time, the scientific Enlightenment was obsessed with the concept of the Preux Chevalier, the dark-skinned, high-born intellectual who challenged the biological boundaries of Europe. Mozart was living in a city that was simultaneously fascinated and terrified by the Moorish blood that ran through the Mediterranean aristocracy. Why did the official court painters, like Joseph Bologne, suddenly stop portraying Mozart with the sun-drenched olive skin tone mentioned in his early travel diaries and start using a powder white palette? It wasn't a lack of vitamin D. It was a preemptive strike against the reality of his phenotype. They needed to harmonize his appearance with the new, rigid definitions of Germanic genius that were being drafted to support the expansion of the Holy Roman Empire. The heroic struggle was the harmonic embargo Mozart faced when he tried to introduce non-tempered scales and blue note slides into the Viennese symphonic structure. We are told he was a rebel, but his rebellion was grounded in a specific African-centered musical logic. In the traditional music of the Maghreb and the Sahel, the notes between the notes, the microtones, are where the emotional power lives. Mozart was constantly pushing the limits of the European well-tempered piano, trying to force it to sing with a Moorish lilt. When critics at the time complained that his music felt restless or unsettled, they were reacting to his attempt to break the rigid white key / black key prison of Western music. He was trying to bring the slurs and the bends of the African voice into the rigid, stone-cold world of the Habsburgs. He was a master of the in-between, a man who lived between races and between scales, and the establishment responded by trying to tune him out of existence. The Great Leveler is the physical ledger of the 1790s, the descriptions of Mozart by people who weren't on the imperial payroll. Take the account of the English musician William Stafford, who visited Vienna and noted that Mozart's appearance was anything but the typical German. He described a man with short, frizzy hair and a complexion that suggested the shores of the Mediterranean rather than the banks of the Danube. Why is this description missing from every textbook? Because it doesn't fit the prodigy of the Alps narrative. They had to create a geographic lie to support the biological lie. They pinned his genius to the mountains so you wouldn't look toward the desert. They gave him a snowy origin story to explain away the heat in his compositions. They were literally terraforming his history to make sure he looked like a native of the North, when every cell in his body screamed of the South. The twist is that the Mozart Piano Concerto was designed as a percussive weapon of cultural infiltration. We are told these concertos are light and airy, but if you look at the original handwritten scores, the accents and the thump of the bass lines are aggressive and driving. Mozart was using the piano as a log drum. He was shifting the weight of the music from the melody to the attack. Every time a modern pianist plays Mozart with delicate, lace-like fingers, they are performing a whitewashed version of a Moorish street fight. To hear the real Mozart, you have to hear the grit, the percussive slap, and the rhythmic defiance that made the Viennese censors wonder if he was inciting a riot under the guise of an evening at the opera. He was a revolutionary using a harpsichord as a megaphone, and the system responded by trying to turn the volume down for 400 years. Why did Mozart's final letters to his wife, Constanza, contain so many references to his masking and his disguises? He wasn't just talking about the carnival. He was talking about his life. He was a man who had to wear a white mask to get his children fed. He knew that in a city like Vienna, a Moorish genius was a curiosity, but a black professional was an impossibility. He played the part of the court jester, so he could continue his work as the high priest of frequency. He was a man hiding in plain sight, using the classical dress code to smuggle African mathematical secrets into the very foundations of Western music. He gave them the overture, but he kept the source for those who knew how to listen. The tragedy is the intellectual gentrification of the 19th century conservatories. After the Congress of Vienna, the victors needed a cultural saint to represent the superiority of the white race. They took Mozart's body of work and cleaned it up. They removed the syncopation from the sheet music. They edited the blue notes out of the performance instructions. They turned a fiery, bronze-skinned master of rhythm into a delicate white angel who heard music from heaven. They removed the human, the African, and the struggle, and replaced it with a divine origin story that made his genius look like a miracle of European biology. They didn't just steal the man. They stole the recipe for genius and put a product of Germany label on it. The question you have to ask is, if the father of the symphony looked like you, what does that do to the history of music? If the man who wrote the Jupiter Symphony was a descendant of the Moors, then Classical isn't a genre, it's a theft. It means that the highest standards of Western culture are actually the exported standards of African civilization. They didn't want you to know that the crown jewel of their cultural heritage was actually borrowed from the very people they were colonizing. They had to bleach the man to keep the stolen goods. They couldn't have the gold standard of music looking like the people they were stripping of their gold. But the rhythmic receipt is still in the pocket of the past. You can't hide the groove in a velvet coat forever. The clash of the cymbals in the Turkish march isn't just a fad, it's a genetic memory. The offbeat drive in the Don Giovanni overture isn't a mistake, it's a heartbeat. We are living in a time where the paint is starting to crack and the bronze is starting to show. Now that the master of Vienna has been revealed as the Moor of the Mediterranean, are you going to keep listening to the official version, or are you ready to hear the unredacted truth? The masks are off, the symphony is loud, and the real Mozart is finally ready to claim his throne. The 1790s weren't just the end of an era. They were the beginning of a biological cover-up that would define Western excellence for the next 2 centuries. While we are taught that Mozart's health failed due to overwork or rheumatic fever, the private diaries of the Viennese medical community, specifically those surrounding the medical faculty of Vienna, tell a story of a man whose physical deterioration was being managed by the same state actors who were drafting the first racial hierarchy laws. Why did the official death certificate list miliary fever, a vague catch-all term, while the eyewitnesses spoke of a swelling and a discoloration of the skin that didn't match any European contagion of the time? It's because the physical body of Mozart had become a liability. As he aged, the Moorish features he had spent a lifetime powdering and hiding under silk became impossible to mask. The bronze skin deepened, the hair texture fought the wigs, and the great Germanic hope began to look exactly like the people the Habsburgs were currently trying to categorize as subhuman. The heroic struggle was the compositional guerrilla warfare Mozart waged in his final symphonies, specifically the Symphony No. 40 in G minor. We are told this is a work of tragic beauty, but if you strip away the strings and listen to the underlying structure, it is a rhythmic manifesto. He was using inverted accents and displaced beats, techniques that are the literal DNA of the African musical tradition. He was making the orchestra stutter and pulse in a way that mimicked the talking drums of the West African coast. The Viennese critics called it agitated and unnerving. They didn't have the vocabulary to say it was black. Mozart was pushing the limits of what a European orchestra could do, forcing them to play a groove that their culture hadn't yet invented. He was a man with a 21st century rhythmic mind trapped in an 18th century stone box, and he used his final years to turn that box into a megaphone for the diaspora. The Great Leveler is the lost estate inventory of December 1791. When a prominent figure died in Vienna, every item in their home was cataloged. Mozart's inventory is a treasure trove of Moorish artifacts, Oriental silks, North African textiles, and instruments that weren't part of the standard orchestral kit. Why does the academic world ignore these possessions as mere decorations? Because they point to a lifestyle that was culturally rooted in the South. Mozart wasn't just inspired by the exotic. He was surrounded by it because it was his home. He lived in a Moorish bubble inside the heart of the Austrian Empire. He was a man who spoke multiple languages, but his emotional language was one of African complexity. They had to sell off his estate quickly and scatter his belongings to make sure the visual proof of his cultural heritage was erased before the first biography was ever written. The twist is that the Mozart piano technique, the high-wrist percussive style, was actually an adaptation of the kora and xylophone playing styles of the Mali and Songhai empires. We are told he was a virtuoso, but a virtuoso in what tradition? If you watch a modern pianist play Mozart with fluid, liquid grace, they are lying to you. Mozart's own accounts describe a clicking and a sharp rhythmic attack that was designed to make the piano sound like a percussion instrument. He was bringing the impact of of the African drum into the drawing rooms of the elite. Every time you hear a delicate Mozart recording, you are hearing the result of 200 years of acoustic bleaching. They took the thump out of the genius to make him safe for the suburbs. Why was the Requiem left unfinished? And why did the stranger in gray disappear into the fog of history? The stranger wasn't a ghost. He was a representative of the very establishment that was preparing to rebrand Mozart. They needed him dead to freeze his image. A living Mozart, growing old and potentially reclaiming his Moorish roots publicly during the revolutionary fervor of the 1790s, was a nightmare for the Habsburgs. They needed a divine martyr, not a black revolutionary. So they let the illness take its course, and then they stepped in to finish the music. The Requiem was completed by Süssmayr, a pure Germanic student, who made sure the final movements were harmonically safe and stripped of the rhythmic heat that Mozart had infused into the confutatis. They didn't just finish the song, they corrected the soul. The tragedy is the skull of 1801. A few years after his burial, a skull was allegedly recovered from the mass grave in St. Mark's Cemetery. For over a century, scientists in Vienna poked and prodded this bone, trying to prove it belonged to the master. But in the late 20th century, the DNA tests were inconclusive and the physical measurements were anomalous. Why? Because the skull showed strong Mediterranean and North African characteristics, specifically the jaw structure and the nasal cavity. The scientific world went into a panic. They couldn't have a Moorish skull sitting in a museum labeled Mozart. So they did what they always do. They labeled the evidence doubtful and put it back in a drawer. They would rather have no Mozart than a black Mozart. The question you have to ask is, if his music is the peak of reason, why is the history of his body a valley of lies? If he was the universal genius, why did his physical reality have to be suppressed to make him acceptable? The truth is that the Enlightenment was a gated community, and Mozart was the brilliant Moor who built the gate. They took his geometry, they took his rhythm, and they took his light. Then they told him he couldn't live there. They turned his Requiem into a celebration of their own superiority, using his own notes to bury his identity. But the rhythm of the universe doesn't care about your labels. The syncopation in the Prague Symphony is still there. The dissonance in the Dissonance Quartet is still there. It's the sound of a man screaming through the mask. We are living in an era where the high culture of the West is finally being exposed as the stolen culture of the South. Now that you've heard the black Mozart in the frequencies, are you going to keep looking at the white mask on the wall? The music is calling, the truth is loud, and the real master is finally ready to show his face. The Viennese music archives aren't just a collection of dusty scores. They are a vault containing the intellectual property of a global diaspora, hidden behind the high walls of Austrian exceptionalism. To understand the depth of the Mozart erasure, you have to look at the racial tax he paid every time he stepped onto the stage. While we are told he was a freelance genius who struggled with his finances, the reality of the 1780s was that the Habsburg economy was built on the exclusion of the Moorish merchant class. Mozart wasn't just bad with money. He was being systematically defunded by an aristocracy that wanted his Africanized harmonies, but refused to let a man with his phenotype accumulate generational wealth. Why do the court records of his contemporaries, like the composer Dittersdorf, describe Mozart's social behavior as erratic and un-European? It's because he was a man living in a permanent state of double consciousness. He was the most brilliant mind in the room, forced to play the role of a talented servant to men who couldn't count to 4 without his help. The heroic struggle was the battle of the tempos that Mozart waged against the metronomic rigidity of the North. We are taught that classical music is about strict time, but Mozart's own letters describe a concept he called rubato, a stealing of time. This wasn't the polite European version. This was a rhythmic displacement that allowed the melody to float over the beat, a direct ancestor to the swing and soul of modern black music. When he conducted his operas in Prague and Vienna, he was known for pushing the orchestras to play with a velocity and fire that left the traditionalists breathless. He was trying to break the stone pulse of the West. He was trying to make the violin weep and the cello shout like a preacher in a ring shout. He was a Moorish shaman in a silk coat, using the orchestra to induce a collective trance, and the establishment responded by trying to standardize his tempos after he died, effectively sucking the life out of his ghost. The great leveler is the iconographic sabotage that occurred in the 1830s, right as the German Confederation was solidifying its national identity. During this period, the Mozart Association in Salzburg began the process of visual consolidation. They went through private collections and acquired every sketch that didn't fit the new, idealized Germanic look. They literally burned the inaccurate memories. Why is it that every authenticated portrait of Mozart today looks like it was painted by the same committee of bleach-obsessed bureaucrats? Because it was. They created a universal Mozart that was compatible with the rising tide of European imperialism. They needed a hero who could be exported to the colonies as proof of white intellectual superiority. They couldn't send a bronze-skinned, broad-featured Moor to represent the civilizing mission. So, they created a marble god and threw the real man into the incinerator of history. The twist is that the classical symphony itself is an architectural theft of African spatial logic. We are told that the structure of the sonata allegro form is a peak of European rationalism. But if you look at the great enclosure of Great Zimbabwe or the fractals in African city planning, the concepts of theme, development, and recapitulation were already there, carved into the earth and woven into the music of the Sahel. Mozart didn't invent this balance. He was the first European-trained composer to rediscover it through his Moorish lineage. He was applying African mathematical fractals to the violin. Every time you hear a Mozart symphony and feel that sense of perfect resolution, you are feeling the geometry of the Nile being translated into the language of the Danube. They took the shape of the genius and called it Western logic. Why was Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro so dangerous that the emperor himself had to review the script? It wasn't just the class struggle. It was the Moorish subtext. The character of Figaro is a servant who is smarter, faster, and more rhythmically alive than his master, the Count. Mozart was writing a blueprint for the overthrow of the racial and social order. He was putting the Moorish mind on top of the European power. The music for Figaro is filled with syncopated defiance, a rhythmic rebellion that the elite felt in their bones but couldn't name. He was a cultural insurgent, using the opera house as a training ground for a new type of human, a human that didn't care about the labels of Salzburg or the decrees of Rome. The tragedy is the acoustic gentrification of the modern concert hall. Today, we sit in silence, wearing tuxedos, listening to Mozart like it's a museum piece. But in Mozart's time, his music was street music. It was loud, it was interactive, and it was hot. People cheered, they moved, and they felt the heat of the rhythm. The standardization of classical performance, the quiet please culture, was invented specifically to kill the African fire in the music. They wanted to turn the dance of the Moor into the study of the scholar. They turned a living, breathing, bronze-skinned master of frequency into a cold, whitewashed academic exercise. They took the swing and replaced it with stiffness. The question you have to ask is, if the music is eternal, why did the face have to change? If the truth of his genius is so undeniable, why did the proofs of his phenotype have to be destroyed? The truth is that they didn't want the truth. They wanted the trophy. They wanted to be the heirs of the universe without ever admitting they were the students of the South. They took Mozart's light and used it to build a white lighthouse that told the rest of the world they were in the dark. They used his own melodies to silence his own people. But the rhythm of the blood is starting to override the lie of the ink. You can't keep the drums of the Sahara out of the violins of Vienna forever. The polyrhythmic secret of the Jupiter Symphony is coming out. The Moorish frequency is being retuned. We are living in a time where the masterpiece is finally being returned to the master. Now that you've heard the Black Mozart, in the vibrations of the strings? Are you going to keep looking at the bleached mask on the CD cover? The symphony is ending, the curtain is rising, and the real Mozart is finally ready to tell you who he really was. The final curtain call for the Austrian prodigy isn't a graceful bow. It's a high-stakes forensic unraveling of the greatest cultural identity theft in the history of the West. While the conservatories of London and Paris spent the 19th century building marble monuments to a pure Germanic genius, the actual genetic and archival trail of the Mozart family points toward a Mediterranean Moorish migration that the history books are terrified to map. Why did the early biographies, written before the 1850s racial purity laws, focus so heavily on his peculiar, non-Western appearance and his unrestrained rhythmic temperament? It's because Mozart was the last of the old world masters. A man who existed before the whitewashed Renaissance was completed. He was the bridge between the high science of the Moorish Maghreb and the rising industrial power of the North. They didn't just adopt his music, they colonized his biography to ensure that the sound of civilization had a specifically European face. The heroic struggle of his final year, 1791, wasn't just about his failing kidneys or his debts. It was about the erasure of the evidence while he was still breathing. Mozart knew that the political winds in Vienna were shifting toward a hardline Austrian first nationalism. He saw his black peers in the Viennese court, like the legal scholar Angelo Soliman, being treated as exotic curiosities rather than equals. He knew that if he didn't anchor his legacy in a universal language, his Moorish heritage would be used to discredit his logic. So he poured the African mathematical fractals of the Sahel into his final symphonies. He encoded the Egyptian mysteries into the magic flute. He was trying to build a fortress of sound that the bleach couldn't penetrate. He was a man fighting for the immortality of his soul, knowing that the painters of the state were already waiting in the wings to rewrite his skin. The great leveler is the acoustic DNA found in the original manuscript of the Requiem. Most people listen to the official version completed by his student Susmayer, which is a sanitized metronomic funeral march. But if you look at the sections Mozart actually finished, the confutatis and the recordery, the rhythmic syncopation is violent, driving, and deeply swinging. It uses a low frequency vibration that mirrors the funeral rites of the West African coast. Mozart was writing a black mass for his own identity. He was telling the world that while his body was being dumped into a mass grave, his rhythm would remain an uncontainable African force. The establishment responded by letting the refined version become the standard, effectively putting a classical filter over a Moorish scream. The twist is that the Mozart effect, the idea that his music increases spatial temporal reasoning, is actually the result of the African polyrhythm, stimulating the brain in ways that simple European folk music cannot. We are told his music is sophisticated because it's white, but the sophistication comes from the complex, overlapping cross rhythms that were developed in the kingdoms of If and Benin centuries before Salzburg existed. Mozart was the courier who brought the Moorish math to the West. Every time a scientist studies the logic of Mozart, they are unknowingly studying the logic of the diaspora. They took the brain and gave it a German passport, while the body of the knowledge remains fundamentally African. Why is there a silent century between Mozart's death and the first modern portraits we see today? It's because they had to wait for everyone who actually saw him to die. They needed to wait for the Moorish witnesses of the 18th century to be replaced by the colonial academics of the 19th. They needed a blank slate to paint the angel of Salzburg. They turned a tawny-skinned, broad-featured master of rhythm into a cherubic porcelain icon of purity. They didn't just lie to you about a composer. They used that composer to build a psychological wall that tells you refinement and blackness are opposites. They used his genius to make you feel like an imposter in the world of high art, when the truth is you are the architect. The tragedy is the cultural Stockholm syndrome that keeps us from claiming our own. We've been taught to view Mozart as a white hero that we have to learn to appreciate, rather than a Moorish brother whose heritage was stolen. They gave us the slave song, but took away the symphony. They wanted us to think that our contribution to music ends at the blues, while the classical world belongs to them. But if Mozart was a Moor, then the classical world is just a black world in a wig. It means that every time you hear a violin, you are hearing the echo of the African coast. It means that the standard of excellence was set by one of your own. The question you have to ask is, if the greatest genius in history had to be bleached to be accepted, what does that say about the civilization that accepted him? If truth was their goal, why was his phenotype their enemy? The truth is that they feared the power of the Moorish mind. They feared that if the world realized the sound of the heavens came from a man of the sun, the empires of the earth would lose their moral authority. They had to kidnap the icon to keep the identity. But the vibration of the universe is finally returning to its original frequency. The mask of Amadeus is crumbling under the weight of the receipts. We are living in a time where the African core of the Western world is being exposed, and the whitewashed Renaissance is finally being revealed as a black-powered reality. Now that you've heard the Moorish master in the strings and the drums, are you going to keep bowing to the portrait, or are you ready to reclaim the source? The symphony isn't over, it's just beginning. The real Mozart is finally taking his seat at the conductor's podium, and he's asking you one final question. Now that you know who I am, do you know who you are?